"You're the bookkeeper?" The operations manager said it, the way certain men say things they've already decided are wrong. Flat, dismissive, final before she'd spoken a word. He was blocking the mill office doorway with his considerable frame, and he had the look of a man who had been managing things his way for long enough that any change in that arrangement felt like a personal insult. Didn't expect a woman. Hazel Dunn had traveled 11 days to reach Cascade Ridge. 11 days by rail and then by wagon on a logging road that rattled every joint in her body and left her coated in a fine layer of cedar dust. She had eaten cold biscuits and drunk coffee that tasted like the tin it was brewed in. She had slept twice in actual beds and once on a supply crate that was only slightly preferable to the floor. She was 29 years old. She had run the accounts for her father's sawmill in Missouri for 6 years, and she had watched, with a clarity she would spend years trying to outrun, as a man with a pleasant voice and a fraudulent contract took everything her father built and left them with nothing but the clothes they were wearing, and the particular kind of grief that comes when you realize the law doesn't always mean what you thought it meant. She looked at the operations manager. His name was Rupert Gaines. She had already learned this from the correspondence, and she said, "Hazel Dunn, hired by the Cascade Ridge Operating Trust. I'd like to start on the books today if you'll show me the records room." He stepped aside, not graciously. If you've ever had to walk into a room where someone has already decided you don't belong, and you've walked in anyway, not because you weren't afraid, but because stopping wasn't something you were willing to do anymore, then you already understand where Hazel was standing that first morning. Stay with this story, follow it all the way through, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because I want to see how far this one travels. The mill sat at the base of a ridge in the Coast Range of Oregon Territory, where the fir trees ran so tall and straight they looked like something deliberate, like the land had been making a point about scale. The air smelled of fresh-cut cedar and pitch, and the particular sharpness of sawdust after rain, which in Oregon in October was most days. There was a millpond to the south, logs floating end to end in the gray water, waiting their turn at the saw, bunkhouses to the east, a cookhouse sending wood smoke up through the tree canopy from before dawn until after dark. Hazel had been walking from the wagon drop to the mill office when she heard it. An axe, steady and unhurried, working somewhere off the main path. Through a stand of young cedar, a man was alone at a downed fir that had fallen across a drainage ditch and needed to be cleared. He wasn't a large man, lean, the way men got who did actual work rather than directed it, moving with the kind of patient economy that came from knowing exactly what needed to happen and having no interest in performing the effort of it. No wasted motion, no looking around to see who was watching. The axe went where it needed to go, and he moved on to the next cut. He wore plain work clothes dark with rain, a hat that had been through several seasons. His hands, when she caught a glimpse, were the hands of a man who had spent years doing what he appeared to be doing right now, not managing the work, doing it. He looked up once. His eyes were a clear, pale gray, the kind that gave you the impression of being seen rather than looked at. He didn't speak. He held her gaze for a moment, the way a man does when he's decided to note something without yet deciding what to do about it. She kept walking. The records room was a disaster. Not chaotic in the way of a busy office, chaotic in the way of a room that had been allowed to become chaotic with purpose, which was different, because intentional disorder served a function. Ledgers from 3 years mixed without system. Delivery tallies bundled in twine and stacked without dates. Wage contracts in a tobacco tin. A stack of documents that appeared to be timber purchase agreements, being used as a surface for a coffee pot that had left a burned ring on the top page. Hazel set down her case, removed her coat, and picked up the top document. It was a delivery tally from 8 months prior. It listed the volume of timber delivered to the Portland buyer that quarter, 412 board feet. In the margin, in pencil, someone had written a different number, smaller, by nearly a fifth. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the rest of the room. "How long have these records been in this condition?" she asked Gaines, who had followed her in. He said, "Long enough," which was not an answer. The previous bookkeeper had left in the spring, for reasons Gaines described as personal, which was also not an answer. She sent him out and started sorting. What she found over the next 4 hours was not immediately obvious, and that was what made it dangerous. On the surface, the books were simply messy. But if you knew how to read accounts, and Hazel, who had kept her father's mill solvent through 2 drought years and a flood, knew exactly how to read accounts. The patterns emerge the way shapes emerge when your eyes adjust to low light. Slowly, and then all at once. Wage rates that didn't match the signed contracts in the tin. Timber volumes delivered that were consistently lower than the volumes recorded at the cutting site before transport. A holding account with a name she didn't recognize, Bray Timber Holdings, Portland, receiving payments she couldn't match to any legitimate service rendered. Small enough to miss if you weren't looking. Large enough, accumulated, to mean something that was not an accident. She was still at the ledger when she heard boots in the hall outside. The man from the drainage ditch stood in the doorway. He'd taken off his hat. His hair was dark and damp from the rain that had started up again. He looked at the papers spread across the table with the quiet attention of a man who recognized them. "Late to be working," he said. "The books are worse than I expected." He glanced at the open ledger. Not casually, she noticed that. "When were these last properly organized?" she asked. "Before Gaines took over the record side. About 2 years ago." "What happened 2 years ago?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasively, more like someone measuring how honest the situation could afford to be. "Things changed," he said. "That isn't an answer." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He looked at the ledger once more. "Don't work alone too late. Lock the room when you leave." Then he was gone. His name was Seth. She learned that from Cody Farr, a young mill hand of maybe 20, who brought her coffee the next morning and lingered in the way of someone who has a reason for being there beyond the coffee. "Seth what?" she asked. Cody shrugged. "Just Seth, works alone mostly. Has a cabin up on the ridge. Nobody tells him his hours." A pause. "Nobody tells him much of anything." She thought about the man who had looked at her ledger with the eyes of someone who already knew what was in it. She went back to work. On the 4th evening, she found it. Under a loose board beneath the records table, not hidden cleverly, just placed where it wasn't obvious, was a second delivery log, a parallel record running alongside the official one, tracking a different set of numbers entirely. The numbers in the second log were the real ones. She stayed with it for 2 hours, cross-referencing. The official log showed volumes delivered to Portland buyers. The real log showed volumes actually cut. The gap between them, consistent, deliberate, averaging 18% per quarter over 22 months, represented timber that had been cut, moved, and sold somewhere else entirely, without appearing in any official record. She put the real log inside her traveling case. She locked the case. She went to supper and she watched, and she said nothing. 2 days later, she found Seth at the millpond checking the boom chains that held the floating logs, methodical. The same unhurried precision she'd noticed the first morning, running his hand along each chain and checking the fastenings without rushing. "I need to ask you something," she said. He straightened. "The name Bray Timber Holdings. Do you know it?" Something went very still in him, not confusion, the stillness of recognition. "Where did you see that name?" he asked. "In the accounts. It's receiving payments with no corresponding service contract. And the delivery tallies don't match the cut volumes. Someone's been skimming timber off the top of every quarter's output for almost 2 years and routing it through a holding company I can't find any legal record of." He looked at the water. "Someone's been stealing from this mill," she said, not a question. "Yes," he said, "they have." She waited. "I've known something was wrong for most of a year," he said. "I didn't have the documentation to prove the mechanism. Just the numbers not adding up and no way to demonstrate how." She studied him. "You're describing this like someone with personal stake in it." He was quiet long enough that she understood. The quiet was its own answer. "Seth," she said, "who are you actually?" He reached into his coat and removed a folded paper. He held it out. It was a letter from the Oregon Territorial Commerce Office, addressed to Seth Aldous Rourke, Cascade Ridge Timber Company, Oregon Territory. She read his name twice. She looked up. His eyes held that same gray steadiness, but something underneath had shifted, the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight very carefully and has finally decided to set it down in front of someone. "This is your mill," she said. "Yes." She looked at the mill pond, at the log decks, at the bunkhouses, at the saw building, sending its thin line of smoke up into the dripping fir canopy. "You've been working it," she said, as a hand. "The way my father worked it, and his father." The silence between them was complicated. "When I came back from Portland 3 years ago," he said, "I'd been away 2 years, handling the business side of the holdings. What I came back to was this. Rupert Gaines had restructured the management contracts and brought in Wendell Bray as an outside operations consultant. The men were being paid less than their contracts specified. The bunkhouses were in disrepair. The equipment maintenance had been deferred for 2 seasons. 3 men had been injured because of it." He looked at the water. "I could have announced myself and fired everyone. Instead, I watched. I worked alongside the men. I learned exactly what was happening and who was doing it. And then I arranged for someone with proper accounting skills to be placed in the records position." The air went out of the moment. "You arranged for me to be hired," she said. "Yes. You knew who I was before I arrived. I knew you'd managed your father's mill accounts for 6 years. I knew the mill in Missouri was taken through falsified timber contracts 3 years ago. I knew you understood from direct experience what a fraudulent delivery record looked like." She looked at him for a long time. The feeling that moved through her was somewhere between manipulative and extraordinarily calculated, and she hadn't decided yet which one mattered more. "You don't get to make me part of something without giving me the information to make that choice," she said. "You're right," he said. "That was wrong. I'm telling you now." She crossed to the bank edge and looked at the logs floating in the gray water. Her father had built his mill the same way, year by year, log by log, until it was something real, and then someone had come along with a consolidation proposal and legal language her father didn't know how to read. The same method, different hands. She turned back. "What do you need from me?" she said. Something in Seth shifted, the posture of a man who has been holding something at considerable effort and has been given permission to breathe. "Everything in those records," he said, "documented completely, irrefutable. How long do we have?" "Wendell Bray comes to the mill quarterly. He's due in 10 days. If he arrives before we have a complete case, he will remove the secondary delivery log and every document that traces back to his holding company." He paused. "I've watched him do it before." 10 days. She thought about the scope of what she'd found, what she suspected remained. "I need access to everything. Every correspondence with Bray, every contract amendment, every payment record going back to when Gaines took over." "You'll have it tonight." She turned to go. "Hazel." His voice stopped her. She looked back. "What I did bringing you here without telling you the full picture, I won't defend it. But I need you to know why. I needed someone who would see this not as an abstraction. Someone who understood what it costs when nobody fights back." She thought about her father, about standing in the empty office of a mill that no longer legally belonged to them. "I understand that," she said. "It doesn't make it right." "No," he said, "it doesn't." The documents he brought that evening, a locked box, a single key, contained 2 years of correspondence between the Mill Trust and Wendell Bray's Portland operation. She worked through them past midnight. By the time she stopped, she understood the full shape of what Bray had built. The skimmed timber wasn't being sold at random. Every diverted quarters volume was being delivered to a depot site 6 miles north of the mill, a site sitting directly adjacent to the proposed route of the Oregon Pacific Railroad's coastal extension. Bray wasn't stealing timber. He was stockpiling it for a rail supply contract. The Oregon Pacific needed millions of board feet for ties and trestles. Bray had been positioning himself as the exclusive supplier by quietly assembling a private stockpile built entirely from stolen Cascade Ridge output. Timber adjacent to a rail corridor was worth 4 times its standing value. She sat back and looked at the map she'd sketched and thought, he's not a corrupt operations consultant. He's a land and timber speculator running a systematic theft operation, and the Cascade Ridge output is the cornerstone. She brought everything to Seth's cabin that night and laid it on his table. He looked at it for a long time. "He needs 1 more quarters volume," he said. "That's why he's coming early." "There's something else you need to know," he said then, and told her about the management contract amendment, the one he'd signed 2 years ago, before he understood what it was, when Bray had presented it as a routine administrative restructuring. She was very still. He can claim you cooperated. He intends to. It's his insurance. If the investigation has teeth, he uses my signature to shift the liability. She looked at the fire. The argument is in the pattern, she said slowly. Every subsequent shipment diversion, every contract amendment after that first one. None of them have your signature. None of them sought your authorization. A genuine restructuring would have required ongoing participation. Fraud required him to never come back to you. The absence of your signature on everything after the first document isn't just evidence that you weren't involved. It's proof the first signature was obtained through misrepresentation. Silence held the cabin for a moment. You built that night, Seth said. It's the only argument that works, and I have 9 days to make it irrefutable. She stood and pulled on her coat. Thank you, he said. Plain and undecorated, the real kind, which is always quieter than the performance. She didn't turn around. Thank me when it's done. The next morning, Cody Farr arrived at the records room before breakfast, with 7 mill hands behind him. They filed in and stood in a space that barely held 4 people comfortably, and they held their papers. Original contracts, pay stubs, letters about wage adjustments they'd been told were trust authorized, and they looked at Hazel with the particular expression of people who have been carrying something unjust in silence for so long that having someone to hand it to is almost more than they can manage without giving way. She worked through all of them, precise, methodical. By noon she had 8 signed statements. By evening she had cross-referenced every one against the corresponding ledger entries and documented the gap, consistent across all long-term workers, totaling nearly $3,000 in underpayment over 20 months. She was binding the document set when Cody appeared in the doorway again. Gaines saw us come in this morning, he said. He sent a rider to Portland this afternoon. She looked at Seth, who had come to stand in the hall. Bray, she said. Most likely. Seth's expression was steady, which means our 10 days is less than that now. She looked at the documents in front of her. 8 statements, 2 years of correspondence. The delivery log discrepancy mapped against the railroad corridor analysis. Not everything she'd planned to assemble, but enough. How fast can we reach Portland, she said. 2 days by horse if we push. I can have them ready before first light. She thought of her father's mill, the empty office. The lawyers who had already filed before her family understood what was happening. Tonight, she said, we leave tonight. They rode out while the mill lanterns still burned. The Coast Range gave way to river country through the first dark hours, and by dawn they were in the lower valley, the Columbia, somewhere to the north, the road widening toward Portland. They stopped twice, once to water the horses and let them breathe, once to eat and look at the map. The animals needed the rest. Pushing them past what they could carry served no one and fixed nothing. Behind them for most of the first day, 2 riders kept their distance, not subtle about it, making a point. Seth noticed them when she did. He said nothing for a mile then. There's a freight depot at the river crossing, public space, witnesses. How far? 3 miles at this pace. He looked at her, or less at another. Go, she said. They ran the horses for 2 miles. The followers gave chase, and then, at the sight of the depot, wagons, freighters, the organized traffic of a public crossing, fell back. Hazel and Seth rested the horses properly at the depot for 40 minutes, watered them, ate something, and rode on. The 2 men followed until dark, then dropped to a distance too far to see and close enough to know. Hazel rode with the document case against her side and thought about what it meant to finally be moving toward something, rather than away. They reached Portland on the afternoon of the second day. The Territorial Commerce Office was a solid brick building on Front Street, and the clerk at the door told them it was after hours. Commissioner Aldridge didn't take unscheduled appointments. Hazel looked at the door. She looked at Seth. Then she turned back to the clerk. Tell Commissioner Aldridge that the operating documents for the Cascade Ridge Timber Company Trust are in my possession, she said. Tell him there is documented evidence of 22 months of systematic timber fraud, falsified delivery records, wage theft affecting 8 workers, and a railroad supply scheme built on stolen inventory. Tell him the man who arranged it arrives by morning stage. She held the clerk's gaze without blinking. Tell him he can see these documents tonight, or he can spend the next 6 months explaining why he didn't. The clerk went inside. 8 minutes later, Commissioner Aldridge saw them. He was a compact, careful man in his 60s, with the particular patience of someone who had spent 30 years distinguishing between things people believed were true and things that actually were. He read the first 2 pages, looked up and said, "Sit down." She walked him through the full sequence. Wage fraud first, original contracts beside the secondary ledger, the numbers side by side, no narration needed. A commissioner of 30 years didn't need things narrated. He needed evidence organized well enough that his own intelligence could move through it. He moved through it. He asked 4 questions, precise and technical, about the holding account structure and the timing of payment transfers relative to the timber delivery cycles. She answered all 4 without hesitation and with specific document references. When she reached the railroad corridor and placed the depot site map beside the 6 delivery diversion records in chronological sequence, Aldridge stopped. He looked at the map for a long time. "This is a deliberate timber assembly," he said. "Not a question." "Yes." Executed over 22 months through systematic volume diversion targeting Cascade Ridge's quarterly output. The stockpile, when complete, would have positioned Bray Holdings as the sole Pacific coastal timber supplier for the Oregon Pacific Rail expansion. Conservative value of that contract position, $40,000 to $60,000. Aldridge set down the map. Something moved behind his careful eyes, the controlled anger of a man who had built his life on the proposition that commerce had rules. Confronting evidence that certain people had decided those rules were for other people. He read the worker statements slowly, every name, every figure. He did not rush through them. When he finished the last one, he was quiet for a moment. 8 workers, he said, nearly $3,000, 20 months. Yes. He reached for his pen. "I'm issuing an emergency injunction tonight. All Bray Timber Holdings transactions in this territory are frozen pending investigation. Cascade Ridge is restored to its primary trust authority as of this moment." He looked up. "My office will contact the city marshal. If Wendell Bray enters Portland on the morning stage, he will be met." He looked at Hazel over the document set. "How long did you have to build this?" he said. 9 days. He was quiet for a moment. "I've handled commercial fraud cases in this territory for 18 years. He squared the papers neatly against the table. "This is the most completely documented private case I've seen come through this office. You understood exactly what you were looking at." "I've seen it before," Hazel said. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." Wendell Bray's stage arrived the following morning and was met at the depot by 2 city marshals and a copy of the injunction. Bray was a well-dressed man of 50, with the groomed confidence of someone accustomed to legal obstacles being manageable. He looked at the marshals with the expression of a man who had handled interference before and intended to handle this the same way. Then he saw Seth. He looked at the man he had known as the quiet faller who worked the drainage ditches and kept to himself, and something behind his confident expression went wrong in the specific way that things go wrong when you realize the situation you planned for is not the situation in front of you. His lawyer was already speaking, already reaching for procedural language. Hazel heard the words insufficient grounds and disputed documentation, and she produced a copy of the injunction, Commissioner Aldridge's signature, the territorial authority's seal, and handed it to the lawyer without a word. The lawyer read it. His expression moved through several stages quickly. Confidence, recalibration. The careful blankness of a professional managing a discovery that the case he'd been briefed on was significantly different from the case in front of him. Bray said quietly, to no one in particular, "How much does she actually have?" The lawyer looked up from the document. "All of it," he said. Hazel stepped forward. "You owe 8 workers in Cascade Ridge $3,000 in wages they earned and were not paid," she said. "You owe the Cascade Ridge Trust a complete accounting of every diverted timber shipment for 22 months. You owe the families whose livelihood depends on that mill the specific knowledge that this time someone was paying attention." Bray looked at her. For one moment, something real moved in his face. Not remorse, but recognition. The recognition of a man whose operation had been built on the assumption that ordinary people didn't push back, confronting evidence that this assumption had failed. Then the marshals moved, and the machinery of consequence began. Cody Farr arrived on the afternoon stage. He had ridden hard when he heard the two men come back empty-handed, had collected the original wage contracts from every man in the bunkhouse who had kept his papers, and had brought them, 7 workers' documents, creased and careful, in a bundle under his arm. He was 20 years old and road-worn, in the deep way of someone who has done something that cost real effort, and when he found Hazel on the steps of the Commerce office, he held the bundle out with both hands. "The men wanted you to have these," he said, "the originals." She took them and looked at this young man who had ridden 2 days, because something needed doing, and he was someone who could do it. "How are they?" she asked. "Waiting," he said, "but different than before, different kind of waiting." She understood exactly what he meant. Seth was standing at the base of the steps. He had been there through all of it. Present without inserting himself, which she had come to understand was the most accurate thing about him. He did not need to be the center of what happened. He needed it to happen. "You said this time someone was paying attention," he said. "Yes." "You meant yourself." She looked out at the Portland street, at the river visible at the end of it, wide and moving steadily toward the sea. "They weren't lucky," she said. "They were owed. There's a difference." He said nothing to that, but she felt him look at her with the particular quality of a man who has arrived at a clear understanding of something, and is not going to obscure it with more words than it needs. They rode back to Cascade Ridge the following morning. The mill was running when they arrived, the saw turning, the pond full, the cookhouse sending smoke through the October trees. Rupert Gaines had left in the night, which Cody reported without sentiment. The men had kept the operation moving without him. The months that followed were the ordinary kind. The commissioner's investigation ran through winter. Bray was convicted in February on 6 counts of commercial fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. The diverted timber stockpile was recovered, its value applied toward restitution. Every worker at Cascade Ridge received full payment of what they were owed, with interest. Seth ran the mill the way he had always run it, present, working, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. Hazel stayed. She had told him in November, standing in the records room with the reorganized ledgers behind her and the injunction copy folded in her desk drawer, that the books still needed proper long-term management. That was true. It was also not the whole of it, and they both knew that. What she found in the ordinary time after the crisis, after the court dates and the depositions and the quiet afternoon, when Commissioner Aldridge wrote to say the case was closed and the restitution distributed, was that Seth Rourke was exactly the man she had seen clearing a drainage ditch on a rainy October morning. He did not become someone different when the weight of what he owned was visible. He did not expand to fill the space that wealth made available. He ate in the cookhouse with the men. He fixed what needed fixing. He listened with the full attention of someone for whom the person speaking was the most important thing in the room, regardless of who that person was. She had come to Oregon with a traveling case and a refusal to stop being useful. She had not come looking for this, but she had found something she had almost stopped believing in, that a person who chose honesty over convenience and action over fear, and the hard work of seeing something through over the comfortable option of walking away, would eventually arrive somewhere that deserved her. On a morning in April, when the firs were putting out new growth and the mill pond was running high with snowmelt, Seth found her at the records table and said, without preamble or rehearsal, "Stay." One word, no decoration. She looked at him for a long moment. "I already am," she said. Outside, the mill turned. The river ran. The mountains held their cold and patient watch over everything that happened below them, indifferent in the way of things old enough to understand that what matters is not the drama of a moment, but the quality of what is built in the time after. Hazel Dunn had walked into Cascade Ridge with nothing she hadn't carried herself. What she left with was everything she had earned: the work, the justice, and the quiet certainty that the man sitting across from her at the breakfast table each morning knew exactly who she was, and had chosen to stay anyway,